Well, we can get into that too, because I was telling Matt right before we started, I started to listen to the audiobook because I can read. I shouldn't say that. I can read. I have this thing where like I get very tired very easily. And no matter how interesting a book is, as soon as I start to read and concentrate, I get super tired. I cannot force myself to read. So I do audiobooks because it's like sort of like a podcast. So I'll listen to it while I'm driving. And I just started to listen to the audiobook that's called After Steve. I think it's sort of how Apple became $1 trillion company and lost its soul. And I know how there have been sort of mixed reviews on this, but I wanted to sort of go in a clean slate and sort of listen to it. And I'm only a little bit into it. But it is interesting because it sort of talks about some of the beginning dynamics about how things changed so drastically after Steve Jobs passed away and how Tim Cook rose to the ranks as the logistics guy and not the creative visionary and sort of out of this world genius, sort of like Johnny Ive, how Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive were sort of cut from the same cloth. Tim Cook was not that way at all. And there's been the debate forever about how Apple and, sort of their future has changed since Tim Cook. And there's always a question for better or worse, but maybe we'll come back to that in a second. Let's go back to the headset. So what you're referring to, Matt, was there was a story, I think it was by the Financial Times or some other, I think it was an international news outlet, and they posted some of the details regarding the issues and the complications with the headset. And I just was sort of skimming through the article, and it was interesting how the team that was working on this headset, at least initially, they were not working sort of in Apple's main, whether it was Infinite Loop at the time, or I think, obviously now Apple Park, they weren't in sort of that ring. They were in like one of those offshoot buildings that's like down the road. And if you didn't know, if you've ever been sort of to the Apple mothership, Apple has obviously that big building, but they own like a bunch of property around there, like a bunch of just random office buildings.
Like almost all of Cupertino.
Yeah, some nondescript buildings, some with Apple logos on them, but basically this project was in an offshoot, building, and the theory behind that was that it would sort of insulate itself from the company, that it was so secretive, it was sort of out of sight, out of mind, and they could work there and sort of do their thing. But the article alluded to problems that presented because it was sort of seen as a lower class, lesser class project, and when the engineers working on the headset needed to communicate with other Apple engineers, they were sort of brushed off. It wasn't seen as important. There was one piece in the article that talked about how they wanted to work on some kind of camera technology working faster on the headset, but this is back in 2018, and they were basically told by the iPhone camera engineers, no, we got to finish the iPhone XS first before we can even, think about this and work on this. And just sort of interesting how those dynamics have changed and how there were a lot of complications getting this thing to market. And maybe the development of it was different than other Apple products that came before it. Obviously, it's been in the works for a while. I think I look back and the first rumors of this, I think, came out in like 2015-ish, maybe a little before, a little after. So obviously this is like 7 years in the making and we're finally getting to this point. But it's sort of interesting to see behind the scenes peek. And we always think about, whatever Apple's next big thing is, they must be devoting all their resources to it. But that's not the case. And also it sort of makes you wonder how many of these offshoot projects exist that are seen internally as the next big thing that just flounder and never become anything.
Well, that, or how many of them exist that will be coming and we don't even know that they exist. Yeah, that's interesting because I guess if you think about it, that's what the iPhone was, right? They were working on these projects. Maybe it wasn't all the way in a back corner, but it was super secretive. Nobody at the company knew about it. There was just a very small team working on it. Same thing with the iPod. So I guess that's just kind of how it works. I think what's weird about this story isn't so much that part. I think it makes sense that it's isolated and it's secretive from the company. It's more the framing of it that this was something that they almost didn't care about. I think that's what's weird about it and a little worrisome. Like I maybe back in 2015, like you said, when we started hearing these rumors, I mean, back then this technology obviously wasn't ready. It was very much, the early days of VR. So maybe back then it made sense that they wouldn't focus so much on this because the tech just wasn't good enough. And I guess, yeah, I don't know. It just makes me a little worried that this story came out. Maybe it's completely bogus and they're conflating two different things and the headset was always slated to be the next big thing, but it does still get me a little bit worried about what this might be. But then we saw this story today, like we were talking about them showing it off, and that is basically ready. And maybe, I can't put it together. I don't know what to think exactly.
It's tough because, on one hand, if this has really been 7 years in the making, and they're still having complications, which, according to the latest rumors, I think from Bloomberg, the reason why people think it's going to be delayed until next year is because there are still issues with some of the tech. I think it was cameras, I think it was overheating, battery. Obviously, it's crazy to think that even inside of Apple, the silicon progression has changed so much since this project started that I wonder when the Apple silicon transition was sort of got going originally internally, if that sort of changed any plans with the headset. Now I think the spec is that it's supposed to have sort of an equivalent to an M1 Pro or M1 Max chip, maybe even 2 chips running this thing. And I guess the big question is this. Well, a couple of questions. Is the headset ready enough to be shown off at WWDC? Is Apple going to show off the hardware of it at all? Are they going to refer to it and just show off the software? Or are they going to do nothing at all? Because that's sort of the big question at this point is, when do they finally crack open the door and talk about this in some way, even if there is no hardware? And I know we discussed this, I think it was last episode, about what Apple could do, and here's the path they could go if they do show the software only, and here's what they do if they do hardware. I guess the question I have is, okay, so they showed off to the board. Obviously, it's in some kind of final prototype stage. How far are we away from this actually being announced? I still think that June just seems a little too optimistic and a little too early.
Yeah, that's the question. Because, you can look back to the iPhone, which was in a very early stage of development. They, that there was that famous story of the perfect path that Steve Jobs had to take on stage. If he deviated even a little bit, it could crash the entire thing. And honestly, if that happened on stage, who knows what the iPhone direction would be now. Probably end up being okay, but it would not be the same hype as as it ended up being when the path turned out perfect and there was no issues. So, on one hand, they obviously talk about things that are not ready. Same thing with the Apple Watch. The Apple Watch was definitely not ready. Honestly, the first version of the Apple Watch just probably shouldn't have existed. They should have waited one more year, because that thing, I'm very happy about that watch. It was so cool at the time, but it was so slow. It was not ready for prime time, and the software was just not ready. So, you could say that they do that with other products. So why would that be different here? I guess I'm more worried about, not worried, but interested in how they're going to, how are they going to show this off? Because we talked about this last week with Google I/O, because they showed their glasses prototype. But if you watch their video that they showed off of this translation feature, not one shot in the entire video is real, if that makes sense. Not because the product doesn't work, but because you can't actually show what this is. Okay, I can see the hardware, you can show me the headset, but I can't actually see what it's supposed to look like. And that is going to be a very difficult thing. I think if any company that would be able to figure out how to do that, Apple would be the one to do it, because they're very creative with their demos and their ads and things like that. But I don't know. I guess the easiest way would be they just put it on and just show you a video out of what you're seeing, kind of what they do with, what they do with the iPhones and the AR demos they do with that. And that's fine, but that doesn't sell me necessarily, because I guess in theory I already get the concept. I know what it is, but I want to see the next level. Why is Apple making this? And then that's that part. And then there's the other part of the technical, hardware of this thing. So we're expecting 2 4K micro OLED displays. So it should be very high resolution and look really good. 15 cameras, which probably goes back to what you were saying about this thing having issues. That's a lot of cameras to keep track of. And it has those because it's going to have hand gesture support. So will it have controllers? I'm guessing not. All those cameras should let you use your hands as controllers, which I think is actually very cool. It's going to have the M-series chip. It's also going to have eye tracking inside. And this is the big kicker. It's supposed to cost maybe $3,000. There's just so many. Every layer of this product has so many questions about it, and whether or not it's ready is just that's the easy part. Honestly, whether it's ready enough to show off, I don't even think is that big of a deal. They could probably show it off at WWDC. That's the least of my worries. I want to know, when can I buy it? am I going to be able to afford it? Is it going to work? Like, there's so many questions around it.
It's hard to justify the price of like a decent used car for this headset. And I think what's crazier too is I'm not envious of the person or the people at Apple tasked with how to show this off, because it's sort of like the OG Apple Watch or iPhone, not so much the iPad. It's really these first generation products that we have to learn, how do you turn it on? How do you charge it? You have to like go through all the basics and fundamentals that I think we take for granted now with new products like Apple Watch or, iPad, MacBook Pro. We all know how those work. And we know with the iPhone, here's a turn on, turn off, whatever, the gestures, whatever, that's fine. But with this, everything is so new that you've got to really go step by step on how to do things. And I think that actually this is one area where maybe these digital events are beneficial to Apple, because they can really just do all CG if they want to, or they can figure out a creative way to do that. Obviously, I think a live demo would be most interesting, but one of the benefits they have here is that they have all the time in the world to do some post-production magic to really maybe show it off the most clear way possible. But to your point too is, CG videos are cool and all, but I want to see like somebody kind of live demo this. How does it work? How does, the Buddha process and the gestures, and there are just so many unanswered questions, which make this at the same time so frustrating, so exciting, because we just don't know. Hey, you! Thank you very much for watching this clip from the Apple Circle podcast. If you want to check out the full episode, hit one of those videos right here, and also hit the other surprise video to see a surprise clip from the Apple Circle podcast. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and subscribe to the Apple Circle audio feeds and on all your favorite podcast platforms linked down below. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to the main Apple Circle YouTube channel linked right down below.